This probably is the youngest speaker that you'll be facing today or in this session. A graduate in economics with honors from the University at Berkeley. After earning her degree, she worked at MIT's Poverty Action Lab in rural Bangladesh and contributed to several policy papers for the World Bank and also the IMF at the Center of Global Development in Washington, D.C. She moved to India and founded Citizen Gauge, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, a technology company operating the world's first waste-to-resource platform that channels waste into energy, compost, and recycled products. She was recently named as one of India's top women entrepreneurs by Cosmopolitan and specializes in creating markets for disruptive technology. She drafted new policies related to smarter waste management systems while working with Citizen Gauge, first customers to champion a waste-to-resource platform. She is a great example of social entrepreneurship, and we look forward to hearing about her journey as an entrepreneur. Ladies and gentlemen, join your hands in inviting Pronita Saxena.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to be here. And I have to say, although I'm not Parsi, there are two very special people in my life who are, one of whom is my mother's adopted godmother in some sense, who is effectively like my nani. And I have an heirloom that has been passed down in her family through Iran, and I would say it's one of my most prized possessions because she's no more. And the other person is actually Rohinton Mistry, because he wrote my favorite book on India, which is A Fine Balance. In fact, I wrote about that in my personal statement to get into Berkeley. So I guess, you know, the world connects and brings us all about in some manner. So I'm here today to describe what I see entrepreneurship as being almost a social movement to create positive social change in some ways. And the story of Citizen Gauge and how this was an example that made me believe this, essentially. So first, I'll just get through a quick summary of what Citizen Gauge is before we get into the nitty-gritty of a few concepts that I'd like to share with you. So when we say we're building the world's first waste-to-resource grid, that probably sounds fancy, but needs a little bit of explanation at least. So we work with facilities. It could be a hotel like Clark's Exotica. It could be, for example, Zareen's restaurant, Red Fork. She's one of our first customers, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we got started then. Or it can be residential communities. Basically, all of us produce waste in basically wherever we go. So these would be our customers. And then we also work with biogas plants, composting facilities, recycling centers, anyone who can utilize material from one industry in some manner. And then we manage this entire supply chain in real time, kind of like Uber, with collectors who are dispatched to take certain waste streams to different places. Now, this was probably one of the early accomplishments. This is a biogas plant in Domlur, in Indranagar, which we were able to fill with organic waste from restaurants around Indranagar. And this plant has a capacity of 5 tons, and it was getting less than 200 kg of waste when we started. And today, we manage over 900 tons of waste every month, and 86% of our customers' waste never touches the landfill. It is entirely recycled or reused in some way. In some cases, it is lighting up parks like this. In other cases, it's providing gas that's burnt in kitchens, completely clean, and it is also recycled, so paper, plastic, any other materials. Now, this is how a mix of customers has evolved. So we largely serve the hospitality segment because, you know, restaurants and hotels produce a lot of waste. We've now started working with breweries as well. We also work with residential communities. So I'll get into this a little bit more later, but essentially it's management associations. So we look for community champions in this manner who are willing to adopt this entire system in their whole community. So think of these as large private gated communities who make decisions as a society. Then we have gotten into logistics companies. So in fact, just before I was about to come up, I was just telling Zarino, there's one issue that's randomly come up, but we serve a lot of online kitchens as well. So if you're getting food from any of these apps, we probably are working with them now and helping them manage operations across multiple branches. And then finally, I'm very proud that we are now working with the Indian Army to look at the cantonments and how waste can be managed from different streams within those campuses. So over the past 2 years, we have diverted over 10,500 tons from landfills. And these are just a few of the customers that we work with. And fortunately, we've received a lot of national and international recognition, both from Germany and the Netherlands. I can talk a little bit about, the challenges for local support, but in fact, the gentleman who walked me over, we were chatting about this earlier, that, where will the resistance really come from? And I do have a treat about that concept in a few minutes as well. Now, looking forward, we actually went to Germany on an international startup roadshow, and these are the different verticals that we're looking at expanding into in a big way in India and beyond. So if you're in any of these industries, we would love to speak with you and understand how we can help you become more sustainable as well. So there was one great example of Airbus creating these trays that allow, on the plane, when you give your waste back, it was great because they said, okay, so we invented this really cool tray. It allows you to keep, different streams separated. So I was listening, and then I finally asked, great, and then what happens when the plane lands? Where does the waste go? So like, oh, well, we don't know. I mean, whatever the airport does with it. So, I mean, but it's these kind of funny stories that you'll find that people are focusing just maybe on what they can see and what they can control, but they're missing that question of, well, what happens to my waste? And am I actually controlling what happens to it? There's a lot of examples like this in manufacturing. A lot of you might be in the real estate field, and I think that has a lot of potential to really look at sustainable living working with energy systems that produce energy on site before you actually even have to, through waste, before you even have to go to the grid. And finally, FMCG and grocery companies, we've gradually started engaging with them and even looking at how do we control what we call post-consumer waste. So how many of you ordered from Amazon? Almost everyone, right? How many of you are so irritated because you'll order something this big and it comes in packaging this? Okay, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and what do we do? Great, I love the lady in the back who's like, 2 hands, this is horrible. So exactly, I mean, these are silly but frustrating problems, and solving them really motivates us. And this is really how we approach doing this in the future. So the first is when we work with these large brands, you'd be surprised how little data they have on what they're wasting and what's happening to it. So we actually start with just footprinting. What is your current state? Then we really have to look at developing a sensor network. So this is where we're getting more and more into IoT type of technology. And finally, you have this concept of what I like to call operational arbitrage. So what you would actually recycle today or reuse will depend on the price for scrap of that material that day. Now that is changing all the time. So this is not a static decision. You need dynamic decision making to actually be able to optimize what should you do with that piece of paper that you have, which for us would be a piece of paper, but for a paper mill or a manufacturing industry, it's you're talking in tons. And then this is where we come in essentially as a grid operator, where we are managing, so we do the footprinting, we establish the sensor network, and then we're doing this operational arbitrage in real time and actually ensuring that the maximum amount of your waste is converted into something recycled, or that you're getting the best price possible that day for the decision that you've made. So that's the future, but let me bring it back to sort of my journey, which was described to you a little shortly briefly a little while back, but perhaps I can walk you through really answering this question, because let me tell you, I never imagined. So when I was in college, or even after graduating, if you asked me that, hey, would you like to be an entrepreneur? I'd be like, what is that? I don't even know what that is, right? So this was not something that was something that I planned. It is just definitely something that evolved, and I would like to think that my journey into entrepreneurship really, I have to go back to this central question that I'm sure all of us have been asked at some point in our life, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? And of course, our answers change at different points in life. But for me, I would say that these three words at the bottom really can be your guiding light for how you actually want to carve out your career. So the first is mission, and I think this is really important. What is that thing that you want to contribute, right? It can be something intellectual, it can be something tangible, it can be whatever you want, but it's something that motivates you to actually take on hurdles. It empowers you with grit, right? So I think if you have a mission, it should be something that is motivating enough for you to want to fight for it, which allows you to then create opportunities. But opportunity can also be something that you're not really born with, which is something that I encountered probably at the age of 7 or 8. As a young girl, I was at a light in Delhi, and there was a beggar kid who came up, was knocking on the window, wanted to sell us something, and I think I winced and looked away or said, whatever, I don't know. And my mother looked at me and obviously was not very happy with my reaction, and she said, Pronita, don't you ever forget, it is sheer luck that you're sitting on this side of the window and not sitting on the other side. So don't you ever forget that. And that has really stayed with me, because it made me realize that how that kid would answer this question, what do you want to be when you grow up, will be very different from how I would answer that question sitting on the other side. And that's, in my 7, 8-year-old naivete, to me was the spark that made me feel, I want to do something about equalizing opportunity. And I think that has really been my mission, that I want to be someone who creates opportunity through social, economic, and political transformation at a systemic level. And I go back to that kid. Why is that kid going to answer this question so differently from me? That should not be the case. He should believe in opportunity. He should believe that he can be whatever he wants to be. But we all know that that's still not real. So that led me to wanting to be a lawyer, because I felt, this is how I can fight for people like this and all of that. And then I actually worked at an NGO in Delhi in trafficking and forced prostitution. And I was probably 16 at the time, and so it was pretty rough. And it got me really frustrated, because I felt like in India, the law doesn't mean anything, right? It's not accessible. The people who are suffering the most are not really even thinking, oh, yeah, I should go to a court and I'm going to get justice there. I don't think that's a thought that even crosses their mind, which is what made me think about, okay, I really want to get into policy research. So I went to Berkeley all gung-ho, and I want to be a development economist, and great, I want to work on policy. And that's how I ended up at the Poverty Action Lab doing research, then in DC. And now this was the next sort of wake-up call in my life, because this was right ahead of the Cancun summit. And I was sitting in this room, and so my job sounded really fancy, and there were all these fancy people, we're at the World Bank, at the IMF all the time. And this is a very closed-door conversation that's happening just ahead of the Cancun summit with the Mexican ambassador and a host of other ministers and people. And someone who's the special envoy on climate change to the World Bank, looks around and basically says, look, we all know that the US, India, China, nobody's going to sign Kyoto, right? So let's just get on with it. But he also made another statement, which was, despite not signing anything, China at that point, this was about 2010, had surpassed everybody as the biggest investor in wind energy. So that made a light bulb go off in my head. I was like, well, policy doesn't matter. China didn't sign, but look, they're investing in, surpassing everybody in wind energy. What's going on? So that was my naive discovery of something we call the clean energy field. And I literally went home and Googled, top 10 clean tech companies to work for, found one, applied, and 9 a.m. the next day, there was an offer to come and interview in Boston. Needless to say, I went. And that's really what got me to working with this really interesting company, which created the concept of demand response. So this is where you actually create a grid so normally what happens is, suppose all of us want to turn on all of the lights here. That's peak demand, AC, cooler, everything. Well, that means that we have to go to the next most expensive source of supply. Instead of doing this, this company called Enernoc, which recently actually got acquired, decided, well, what if we could pay you to not turn things on, right? So if you look at this in the commercial industrial context, this would be saying you have a lot of cold storage. If you turn off your freezers for, let's say, 3 hours, but leave the door shut, nothing's going to happen. It's fine. But you're not consuming a lot of energy. So this was the idea behind demand response, or demand-side management of the grid. And that concept really stuck with me because in Boston, this is where I, gradually ventured into the startup space, moved to India to join a friend's startup from college in the water space. And lo and behold, I think Citizen Gauge is really an amalgamation of these ideas, if you think about it, because we're doing a lot with alternative governance. We're doing a lot with energy and smart city sort of management. But at the end of the day, we're really motivated by the impact that we have and the lives that we're able to change through better opportunity. So, of course, now, what is a social entrepreneur? I think this is definitely something that we could sit and discuss and debate. And just for you, I, looked up some interesting phrases. And these are some of my favorites. So what I love about this quote from Julius Caesar, he just said to his army, fortune favors the bold, right? And I really think entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship is a lot about that. Because you're basically saying, look, I'll be bold, and if I'm smart about it, at some point there's going to be some fortune somewhere, hopefully. Fingers crossed, right? So I think this really summarizes a lot of what our mentality would be. There's a much more detailed description next, which is someone who is driven by more than just financial incentives, has a desire to change the world. I think that's really important because if you see fortune and, the money part is sort of secondary. It is more that you have to be motivated by causing positive social change. And you're obviously adapting innovative solutions to some of the most pressing societal issues and complex problems. And obviously, you have to have a solid business model and so, you're grounded in business. So you're grounded in very direct transactions that drive value and allow you to pursue, hopefully, bold and innovative ideas. And the bottom one I'd let you read on your own, but I love the last phrase here, which basically says, you must combine the characteristics represented by Richard Branson and Mother Teresa. So you can combine, if you just think of what this person might look like, that's essentially, what social entrepreneurship could be. And for me, it really started with solving a really complex and multidisciplinary problem, which is right there. So if I were to ever say, what is the statistic that gave birth to Citizen Gauge? It's this. So over 85% of India's waste can be recycled, but 90% sits in landfills. Who thinks this is stupid? Great, I did too. And we said, this is a systemic, it's a symptom, right, of a systemic problem, multiple systemic problems. And we said, well, why can't we fix this? What is an alternative? If 85% of our waste can be recycled or reused in some way, why on earth aren't we doing it? Well, nobody else is doing it either. So a lot of times, one of the things that I found really frustrated about coming back to India, and maybe a lot of you feel this as well, our thinking in our own capabilities is so small. Right? So there's a phrase in Hindi that I like to say, which is, हमारी अपने बारे में सोच इतनी छोटी है कि हम सोच नहीं सकते कि हम कुछ बदलाव ला सकते हैं. Right? So it's basically that this idea that we always want to look outside, to the West. Let's copy and paste solutions. They must have figured out waste management. No, they haven't actually, because even in Europe, they are burning which is, incineration of most of their waste. And the US landfills almost 70% of their waste. That's the reality. So this is actually, if you look at waste management as an industry globally, these are the three words that I would use to describe. It's huge, it's worth 600 billion. So just the movement of garbage to landfills is a $600 billion industry globally by 2020. It's monopolistic everywhere. So this is not an India problem. It is corrupt, it is mafia driven everywhere. I mean, in the US, Europe, everywhere, it's the same story. And it's very infrastructure heavy. So all the time you need land, you need a lot of money for equipment. Does this sound like any other industry you can think of? So if you just look at the words in yellow, would you like a clue? Okay, oil. What is oil a bigger part of? Yes, loudly. The energy industry, right? So imagine that we're at the cusp, but nobody's even realized this. No one's talking about it, right? So imagine what happened to the energy industry. We would really like to see the same thing happen. So breaking apart, decentralization, deregulation within the waste management industry. And who would guess that the person who really inspired me to think about taking these things apart was actually Barack Obama. So I had the privilege of attending the town hall a couple of weeks back that President Obama held in Delhi with what he liked to think of as 280 of India's youngest civic leaders. And I also was lucky enough to have the opportunity. I don't know if you've seen the video. It's quite embarrassing. I'm almost jumping out of my seat with my hands in the air, hoping that he'll call on me. And finally, he did. I was the second to last question. But I really asked him the simple question about what do you do? So a startup like us, right? Our biggest problem is, so we've figured out the solution. 86% of our customers' waste doesn't touch a landfill. We've worked with a critical mass of consumers, restaurants, businesses, residential communities in Bangalore. But now when it comes to scale, there is no way that we can scale without working with the government on better policy. And what do you do when the vested interests are so strong in maintaining the current state? Right? How do you actually bring change about? And this is where President Obama schooled me on, international television on something he likes to call power analysis, which is a tool that comes out of community organizing. And I kid you not, the next day, it was amazing, right? So I was up all night researching, what is community organizing? How do I not know about these tools? So it's brilliant. I thought it was pretty amazing that a politician and someone who had been a president was sitting there saying, look, kids, the current state is the current state because someone's making a lot of money off of it. So if you want to bring change about, you basically have to put up all of the stakeholders, who is making money, who has power, who can you work with, who's going to resist you, map it out. Just get some chalk and a blackboard and start there, right? And I thought this was pretty inspiring advice. And then when I looked this up even more, this is actually a course that he has taught before because he was a community organizer. And a lot of this, the concept of community organizing is, I think, really powerful, probably quite relevant in your own community when, you feel like you're a minority or you feel like you're trying to bring about change and the powers that be just won't allow it. So how do you make that happen? I think that's what this whole analysis is about, and I'd really encourage you to sort of look at that because essentially for us, it's become our framework to evaluate how we select which city to expand to next. The other part of this is becoming a cross-industry connector. So the big concept that you must have all heard about is circular economy. Well, today, the reason why this 85-90 thing is happening is because we're sitting in a framework of linear economies. And what we're really trying to do is get to the circular economy, but in order to do that, we have to link up different segments. And that hasn't yet happened. In fact, if you look at Germany, where we visited, they're one of the global leaders, they're creating something called the energy transition. If you look at, it's 0.9% of 30%, right, is waste. That's their portfolio of renewables. In India, it's similar. Waste to power is 0.04%, right? So this is a very big sector that could be tapped, but it is still highly untapped. So going from here, I mean, I think these are three words that I would like to leave you with when you think about these kinds of industries. Because this was a conversation we had with one of the environmental ministers in Germany for the Ruhr region, which is fascinating because it was an industry, it was very heavily steel and coal oriented. And so they have been looking at, resilience and how do we come out of essentially a depression. And a lot of it is thinking about, well, how will the future of energy look, right? And these are the three themes that had really emerged. So one is digitization. Now, waste is an industry, I can tell you, there is absolutely no data. Forget it being even in a computer, right? Half the time, everybody's just writing in nonsense. This has happened to me at, biogas plant. I was literally looking at every pile coming in, getting it weighed, and then, we had our total, and I'm calculating it. And the guy says, and I think it totaled up to maybe 2.5 tons that day, and the guy says, Madam, no problem, right? 3.54 tons, what's the issue, right? So this idea, and then the funny thing is, that notebook in whatever form is going somewhere, but it's not verified data. So digitization is huge. The second theme is really decentralization. I think more and more we're moving towards looking at, well, how do I become self-sustaining? How do I, in a small way, participate? Whether it's, now you have like rooftop solar is the big thing, right? Even though you have these large solar farms, similar things are happening across wind, now even biogas. We're looking at going smaller and smaller rather than saying, let's go bigger and bigger. And the last, and I think being in the world's largest democracy is really important. We live in the digital age. We've been able to put, missions to Mars, people on the moon, all these kinds of things. Why aren't we able to bring our basic civic services into the digital age? Right? And I think this is one of the key challenges. How do we democratize some of these most essential resources? And I think digitization and decentralization will really allow us to do that. So of course, this is, my last question to you is, well, how do you really participate? The main thing here is why this system has existed today is because we don't have enough processing capacity. As you saw, biogas, waste to power is a minuscule portion of how we think about renewable energy. The second one is without any data, we can't have real-time operations. So digitization here is key. And the last is, what you do with all the water bottles that are all sitting around here is going to determine whether they get recycled or not, right? So your behavior is the number one determinant of whether something is going to get reused or recycled. And we didn't have a way to do behavior management. Nobody thought about waste in that way before. So in that sense, I think one of the key takeaways for us working in Bangalore has been we are absolutely a community movement. So this is why I think it'd be really useful, if you want to talk to Zareen about how we got started. She was amazing because she actually heard a talk that I was giving about a residential community and said, well, I really believe in what you guys are doing. Why can't we get this started in Indiranagar, even if we get a few businesses together? And she did, and that actually turned into a luncheon that almost 36 business owners came to and participated in. And today I'm proud to tell you we serve almost 50 to 70 restaurants in Indiranagar alone. Right, so we've really, really grown, but it wouldn't have happened if someone didn't come forward and say, I want to try something new. And this is really the vision that we have. We want to work with citizens, businesses, brands, build an industry. We have to work with them. People who want to innovate and share this vision of not just responsible waste management, but maximum recycling and renewable energy production. And this is where I think you play a huge role. I want you hopefully to see that entrepreneurship is a movement. It is not a single, especially when you're talking about social entrepreneurship, we need social movements are not starting without you, right? And this is really where I think these are 4 ways at least that you can really support entrepreneurs. The first is let us be your vendors. If you are willing to take a risk, as Zareen did, and to be very honest, and you can ask Zareen about this as well, they actually invested in us because so I think the first group of 7 to 15 restaurants paid double or triple what they were paying the local guy to just go and dump the waste and take it wherever he wants because they wanted us to be able to demonstrate this as a model. And, a few months later, we were able to drop their prices. But that belief in us, right, working with us as a customer I think that was huge. And I don't think I would be here today if, Zareen hadn't taken that chance on us, right? Um, Similar to Zareen, there would be people who are community champions in communities. Now, these are really important because whether you go and talk to someone about what we do or you help us get a meeting with the management association in a building who might be interested, you are really helping us, right? Create positive change. Industry leaders. So we were actually approached by a company that produces cables for the energy industry. And they heard our presentation in Berlin and came up afterwards and said, can you guys help us become a zero scrap company? We want, if you can show us success in this, we want to take you to the rest of the energy industry. So demonstrating industry leadership in that manner, especially in India. So I have to tell you, some of our investors thought, you know what, guys, you have to go to Europe to be able to find industry leaders. Indian industry is just not interested. They don't want to be leaders, they're still copy pasting. I would love to prove them wrong, right? Because I do feel that it is much more about personal intent. I don't think, if you get, perhaps if you get Ratan Tata's to say, you know what, and he has done a lot of that stuff, right? He has dared to be different. So I think we just have to find risk takers. And finally, of course, there are, financiers as well. So I think there was I would really encourage you to take up the model that was discussed earlier about zero interest loans for entrepreneurs. I think we definitely lack risk capital, right? Or even scaling capital. Now, as we're looking at getting into new cities, this is a big component and we're able to adjust the models, but you're never going to run out of the need for money. So these are different ways that I would suggest you support social entrepreneurs. And if you would like to get in touch, you can please, my email and my number are up there. And I'm sorry, I won't be able to stay for lunch, but I'd love to take some questions. Thank you.
Yes, sir, from Los Angeles, I think.
Homi Gandhi from Los Angeles, yes, of course. There is a lot of waste which is being created, as you say, 85 to 90% is in the landfills. So why don't you go and collect at the landfill, which will be easier rather than involving the various customer services?
Great question. So the reason why the waste in the landfill is a waste is because it's not segregated. So we don't have the technology. So the amount of time, the labor that would go in to actually segregating at the landfill pretty much renders it impossible in this day and age to utilize that. So in the US, there is this concept of scientific landfills where they've lined it up and then they just cover it up, and whatever methane is released, they're capturing it. But do you know how inefficient these processes are? So I actually visited a plant in Delhi recently where they have entirely mixed waste coming in, and their yield for compost, right, is 15 to 20% at the most. So the guy I was speaking to wasn't even able to, we couldn't even have a conversation because what I was explaining to him is, look, 60% of the waste we collect, 100% of it is segregated at source, and 60% of it is organic. So my truck goes straight to the biogas plant, pours it into the tray, and we have maybe a rejection of 4%. So effectively, you're talking about rather than 20%, you're talking about over a 55% yield, right? That is actually possible if you have segregation at source. So you could try to, capture whatever methane is coming from the landfill, but it's mixed waste and it's really, suboptimal is an understatement, right? Because you have so much more resource capture that could have happened if you had segregation at source in place, which now, in fact, New York is starting to explore a voluntary organic waste separation program, but Bangalore is actually very progressive. As a city, we have mandatory segregation into organic waste, dry waste, and reject waste. And if you don't do that, you can be fined. So that's really critical, that if you try to do things once at already the landfill, it's too late. Your yields are really small.
Yes. You've met Diana before? Well, she's done a lot in Indiranagar. At the Times of India has written an article about her with a kind of a headline that says she's the garbage queen.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Can you do it a bit louder? Yeah, applause.
Yay!
It's not really a question. It's just I wanted to inform you that as a community in our Resident Welfare Association, we have 90% segregation. 10% is the, commercial waste, which is something we've been really banging our heads since 1995. We are not able to get them in line. I want to know, or I want a secret from you, how can we break this mafia? Because it's a huge mafia. And as you are very well into this, you will realize that it's not only the mafia, but it's the policy makers who are not letting us go ahead with it. I've been requesting the commissioners since 2 decades to allow us to find people so that if they don't have enough people, our association committee could go ahead and find. But this has just not seen the day of light.
Well, so I think first and foremost, what you said is really important for the FMCG sector. So we have to start looking at something called extended producer responsibility. So it would essentially say that, look, Unilever, you produce the Dove shampoo bottles, you are responsible for what happens to them at the end of it. And I think they are easier to find in that sense. So I think that there is that movement, and I do feel that that will yield a lot of results. It's also a very hard thing to solve. So, for example, one of our customers is Fresh Menu, and I was really impressed. They were actually willing to do a weekly kiosk in the communities where they send the most amount of orders to get back their containers, right? But I think that was a great first step. Second thing you said about, how do we really disrupt this mafia and the commissioner, all of these things. So honestly, like what I found is for a certain level of change, you can just do a lot of things outside of the system. But definitely to scale, and that's kind of where we are, bumping up against this. So just just a few minutes before, right, coming up here, there was this random issue, and I've gotten so tired of these random issues coming up, where I also have to say, community activism, right, how that is done is also really important, because in many cases what we found is it's all political, right? So even activists in certain communities, I'm sure you might have encountered this, they're also doing it because they want to get into the limelight, or there's, some of this stuff happening. So in many cases, they actually don't know the on-ground realities. They've never really done operations, but they actually get in the way, right? And then you have the community activist side, you have the officials who are all, pretty clueless because they have no data coming in from the ground. And then you have us who are perhaps, I don't know, entrepreneurs or vendors or whatever, who are like providing the service and who have the information. And it's somehow that these three groups have to figure out a way to cooperate and work together. And I don't know if, data is the answer to that. I don't know if we just have to be a lot more creative, looking at policy in a different way. But the reality is, unless we have an alternative to the tender system, right, which is basically that the government cannot invest in innovation. You have to open up your balance sheet. You have to be profitable. There is no way a startup would even qualify, right, to take on a tender. So I think we have to get creative about that level of essentially governments taking risks and being able to try out new things. I think that is going to be the basis of any smart city movement anywhere.
We're
I think
also
Diana,
planning.
basically what she's saying is don't waste your time.
We're planning to write from the Nilgiris, Namma Nilgiris group. We're planning to write higher packaging is returned by having some vendor or somebody there, because it's a very big issue in the Nilgiri biosphere.
If I can just add to the producers, is there a way you can be a little bit more forceful? I mean, can you post stuff on social media? Can you bombard,
Yes, yes.
so that you have to make them care. Like, they have to see the economic value in it. And for this, there's actually an amazing group out of Brazil called Our Cities, Minhas Cidades. And they have some incredible community organizing campaigns that they've run, called the pressure cooker, they've put in a CCTV camera outside of a elementary school that was going to get razed to the ground to put in a stadium ahead of the World Cup. And it was amazing how they had a guardian, and basically there was every second somebody was watching that school the CCTV camera feed, and they would press a button and a message would go out to everyone. And they would all come and and you know and they would just block and stand in front of the bulldozer. But I think that's really effective organizing with also something that's concrete. And today the school is still there, right? So I mean they were really successful. So I think we have to get creative in that way here in terms of how we really engage these different groups.
Thanks.
Thank you. If you don't go out for lunch, there are a lot of food that will be wasted. Okay. No more questions. Thank you. Excellent presentation, Pronita, and I would like to invite Aaron Master to kindly felicitate Pronita. Congratulations. At a young age, you're doing a lot of good work.
We're just
Delighted.
trying.
Delighted.
Thank you.
Please.
Sure.
Give her a big hand, ladies and gentlemen.